Throughout the semester, we've talked about dozens of different topics in our class. However, the three that I want to focus on today for my final video is dark side communication in romantic and family relationships, social media, and culture. So, the first I want to talk about is culture. Um, Culture plays a big role in how we communicate, um, whether we're um, in our subcultures. So that could be our families, that could be within school, that could be at work, that could even be like church groups, just any smaller group that we're a part of. That could be by race, ethnicity, gender, literally anything. Um, all of those things, all those cultures that we are a part of, do affect how we communicate. So there were a couple questions that we were asked to answer. So I just want to start with those. Is the dark side of communication pancultural? Why or why not? From what we've learned and what we've researched, it's not fully pancultural. While communication is culturally based, it doesn't mean that if you grow up in a culture that is maybe a little bit more aggressive, that you'll also be aggressive. So we learned that negative communication is universal, it happens across cultures, but its interpretations vary from culture to culture and even person to person within the culture. We learned that what may be offensive in one culture might be completely normal to another. An example I have of this is um, one of the women in my church had just had a baby, and her mom quite literally asked her husband if he was going to divorce her because she hadn't lost the baby weight yet, and it had been like 2 weeks. Um, and in our culture, that's obviously very offensive. You should not comment on somebody's weight in our culture. But in Asian culture, which is the culture that she's a part of, it's very normal. That's a very common thing. And so that's obviously very offensive to us. But so again, it just varies across culture. Second question we were asked is what types of strategies could be employed to engineer society away from aggressive communication. We learned that education and awareness, empowerment, supportive environments, policy and regulation, and community engagement can all help deter our society from resorting to aggressive and dark communication. Something we talked about throughout the entire semester is dark side communication a genetic tendency? It can be partially genetic. Aggressive communication is a combination of biological, environmental, and individual factors. We learned through our research that parents play a big role in the development of their children's personality traits. So intergenerational aggression can be seen through three approaches. So it's hereditary, observation, and parenting styles. If a child observes their parents resorting to aggressive communication, they are more likely to be aggressive communicators. And then again, something like we talked about in class, if we have that switch in our brain that's just like this to get ignited, if we're just that quick to get triggered, we're probably more likely to resort to aggressive communication. The fourth question was provide examples of aggressive cultures that are not necessarily known for dark side of communication. While we didn't find any particular cultures or countries that are known for dark side communication, we did learn that societies that follow more of an individualistic culture are more receptive of aggressive behavior than those of collectivistic culture. So we did learn that the US contains low levels of interpersonal trust and cooperation, and a high value placed by parents on obedience of children. And that's a very individualistic view. Poland, which is kind of in between individualistic and collectivistic, do see it differently. And they are a little more aggressive, but not in the ways that we would think. It's kind of more passive. The final question was, can we regulate dark side communication? How are we doing it? And how can we continue? So we did learn through research that there are no like legal or government regulations against harmful communication. So there's no government regulation against like fraud, threats, defamation, and like there's no laws protecting children from harmful content. Um, I think like most recent one is on Roblox, like kids are getting sexually trafficked and cyberbullied, and there's not really a whole lot of regulation going on there. Um, However, there are features online that allow people to block, unfriend, or mute content that they don't want to see. So individually, we have the option to report and kind of just steer ourselves away from content that we don't like. Um, and then within like workplaces and stuff, there is the option to like go to therapy, go to HR, or trusted information to help address any abuse or mistreatment. Um, Overall, we talked about how dark side kind of just varies through culture. So the second part I want to talk about is um, violence, especially within the families and romantic relationships. We watched a documentary called Breaking the Cycle, Call Me Dad. Um, and some things that stuck out for me from that is that there's no typical abuser, there's no typical climate. It comes from it comes from anybody in any walk of life. Um, there isn't anything that is necessarily reason for it. They talked about how it's a choice to be abusive, that even if you grew up in an abusive household, you still had the choice to change the cycle. Um, let's see. Additionally, we watched a TED Talk, and a lady talked about how she had been part of a abusive relationship, and how one of the biggest questions that is asked is, well, why does she stay? And she said that she didn't know she didn't know that he was abusing her. She felt like she could fix him, and that she was the only one who could help him conquer his demons. She wanted him to love her and for him to feel the love that she had for him, and so that makes it hard to leave. The final thing I want to talk about is digital footprint, specifically within social media, and especially within relationships. We talked about how when if you break up with somebody, the relationship transforms, but there's still ways that you always like they are always going to be there, especially in our digital age. We talked about how after a breakup, there's so many things left online: pictures, DMs, friends that you've made, social media memories that will come up, social networks, and even passwords and accounts. I know a lot of people share their passwords to their social media accounts with their significant other, and then they break up, and those become like a stage of war. Happened to a personal friend of mine. So, how does this all relate? Well, in culture, we talked about how different things can be seen as dark side communication, but it varies across culture. But I just want to kind of focus more on US culture. Even though it's kind of hard to define by region because there's so much diversity in the United States, overall, we can talk generally as a whole. It's not going to be, everybody is like this. It's not going to fit everybody in a circle, but it can be general. In the US, we see a lot of domestic violence. That's something we see a lot, and it can even come through social media. One of the biggest things we see in social media within domestic violence is stalking after the relationship has been terminated. There's a sense of control that abusers want to have over their victims, and so if they have access to those social media channels, they can do that. Across cultures, abuse can be seen differently. It doesn't mean that it's any better or good, but in some cultures, some violence is seen as acceptable. Cultures, especially, I think that tend to have more stereotypical gender roles or place a higher or place men on a higher pedestal than women. Um, I think domestic violence comes, it's like a little less talked about. It's a little more normalized, even if it shouldn't be, or even if we as a culture interpret that as bad. For some of them, that power dynamic between a husband and a wife can, that's just normal. That's just a societal, cultural norm that they have in other countries. But in the US, um, we do believe, most of us believe that um, men and women should be equal, especially within a partnership. Um, like I said, social media plays a huge role in that as well. Excuse me. There's control that a abuser can take over within social media, whether that's what they post, who they talk to, how they communicate, all of that. Especially, something else we talked about is retroactive jealousy. That's being jealous of your current partner's past partners. I think that can also lead to types of abuse. It's like, oh, if even if it's just like verbal abuse, that's still, not verbal abuse isn't any less than physical abuse. It's still damaging to the person. Overall, culture ties into like everything within dark side communication, but I think especially within social media norms and within cultural norms in relationships and domestic violence, um, just plays a big role on how we perceive those things as a person, as a society, and as a culture. Um, to wrap up, I think that understanding dark side communication, verbal aggressiveness can help us to not fall victim to it and to not um, resort to that ourselves. If we can be educated in what verbal aggression and dark side communication looks like, I think we can develop healthier relationships and just healthier habits overall. Thanks.